74,000 years ago, this exact patch of ground did something that almost ended the human story before it really began. It erupted, not the way a mountain usually erupts, with a plume and a river of lava and a bad week for the nearest town. It erupted on a scale that has no modern comparison. Nearly 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock and ash blasted into the sky in a matter of days. To picture that, imagine emptying out a lake the size of a small country and firing all of it straight up into the stratosphere. Ash fell as far away as India, in some places 6 meters deep. The sky over half the planet went dark. Global temperatures dropped by several degrees and stayed low for years. And when it was finally over, the ground where the mountain used to be had simply collapsed inward, leaving a hole 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide. That hole filled with water. Today we call it Lake Toba. It's one of the largest and deepest volcanic lakes on Earth, a place so beautiful that millions of tourists visit every year without ever quite grasping what they're floating on top of. Because Lake Toba is not really a lake, it's a scar. It's the healed over wound of the single largest volcanic eruption in the entire history of our species. And on the evening of August 15th, 2026, that scar moved. At 1754 local time, a powerful earthquake tore through northern Sumatra, its epicenter just 15 kilometers from the town of Pematangsiantar, right on the doorstep of the Toba caldera. The United States Geological Survey put it at magnitude 6.9. More than 11 million people felt the ground move. And within minutes, a question began racing across the internet faster than any official statement could keep up with. It was the question anyone who knows this region's history would ask first. It's the question you might be asking right now. Is the supervolcano waking up? Hold on to that question because I promise we're going to answer it fully before we're done. But the honest answer is more surprising than a simple yes or no, and to understand why, you need to understand what actually happened beneath Sumatra that evening, because the story the headlines told and the story the seismographs told were not quite the same story, and the gap between them is where the real drama lives. Before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who wants the truth about these events rather than the panic, consider subscribing. This channel exists to separate what's real from what's noise, and there's going to be a lot of noise in this one. Let's start with what we know for certain. The earthquake was real, and it was significant. Magnitude 6.9 is not a tremor you sleep through. It's the kind of quake that cracks walls, knocks objects off shelves, and sends people running into the streets. The epicenter sat almost on top of one of the most densely populated corners of Sumatra. Pematangsiantar alone is home to more than 250,000 people. Just 70 kilometers to the northwest lies Medan, a sprawling city of nearly 2.5 million. When the USGS ran its automatic population models, the numbers were staggering. Roughly 11.5 million people are estimated to have felt moderate shaking. Another 4.7 million felt lighter shaking. Tens of thousands more felt at least a weak jolt. In a single instant, a piece of the earth beneath 16 million human beings shifted. And yet, and this is the first thread that doesn't quite fit, the USGS issued what's called a green alert. Green is the lowest level on their scale. It means a low likelihood of serious casualties and a low likelihood of major economic damage. For a magnitude 6.9 sitting under 16 million people, that seems almost impossible. A quake that size, that shallow, and that kind of population density should have been a catastrophe measured in thousands of lives. So why wasn't it? That's the first clue. And to follow it, we have to go down, way down. But before we do, there's a second thing you need to understand, because it changes how you should read everything that follows. This earthquake did not happen in isolation. It was not a lone event on a quiet day. It was, in fact, the third major earthquake to strike Indonesia in the span of a single 24-hour period. Rewind just under a day to 21:58 UTC on August 14th. A monstrous magnitude 7.7 earthquake ripped through the Flores region more than 2,000 kilometers to the southeast of Toba. That one was deadly. The death toll climbed past 50 within hours, with thousands of people forced to evacuate their homes as rescuers dug through rubble and landslides looking for survivors. Buildings collapsed in East Manggarai. Entire communities were cut off. It was, by any measure, a genuine disaster. Then came an aftershock in the same region, magnitude 6.1 to 6.2, depending on which agency you ask. And then, 13 hours after the Flores quake, the ground beneath northern Sumatra let go with a magnitude 6.9 near Toba. 3 major earthquakes, one country, one day. And a supervolcano with a body count in its distant past, sitting right in the middle of it all. You can see, can't you, how the story writes itself. You can feel the pull of it. 3 quakes, escalating dread, the largest eruption in human history, stirring beneath a tourist lake. It has everything. It has drama, scale, and an ending too terrifying to look away from. There's only one problem, and it's a big one. Let me ask you something before we get to it. When you imagine an earthquake, where do you picture it happening? Most people picture it right beneath their feet, maybe a few kilometers down, a crack in the crust, snapping like a dry branch just below the surface. And for a lot of earthquakes, that picture is exactly right. The devastating ones, the ones that flatten cities, are usually shallow, striking within the top 10 or 20 kilometers of the Earth. Now here's the number that changes this entire story. The Toba earthquake did not happen 10 kilometers down. It did not happen 20. According to the USGS, it originated at a depth of 172.5 kilometers. The European agency EMSC put it even deeper, at around 180. Some solutions placed it deeper still. Stop and sit with that for a second. That's not a crack in the crust. The Earth's crust in that region isn't even that thick. This earthquake happened far below the crust entirely, deep inside the mantle, more than 100 miles straight down. That is roughly the distance from a major city to the next one over, except pointed toward the center of the planet. And suddenly, the green alert makes perfect sense. This is why 16 million people felt a magnitude 6.9, and the casualty estimate stayed low. When an earthquake happens that deep, its energy has to travel an enormous distance before it reaches the surface. By the time it arrives, it's spread out and weakened. The shaking is broad and widely felt, hence the 11 million people. But it's rarely the sharp, building-cracking violence of a shallow quake right under your town. The depth was a shield, but the depth tells us something far more important than why the damage was limited. It tells us what actually caused this earthquake. And that's where the whole supervolcano narrative begins to fall apart. Here's what you have to understand about this part of the world. Sumatra sits on one of the most violent tectonic boundaries on the planet. Off its southwestern coast runs the Sunda Trench, a place where one gigantic slab of the Earth's crust, the Indo-Australian plate, is diving down and underneath another, the Sunda Plate. Geologists call this a subduction zone. It's the same kind of boundary that produced the catastrophic 2004 Boxing Day earthquake and tsunami that killed more than 200,000 people. This is not a quiet neighborhood. It's one of the great engines of destruction on Earth. When one plate dives beneath another, it doesn't just vanish. It keeps going, sinking deeper and deeper into the mantle at a steep angle, a cold slab of rock plunging into the hot interior of the planet. And as that slab descends, it bends, it cracks, it gets squeezed and heated and chemically transformed. All of that stress has to go somewhere. And every so often, deep inside that sinking slab, 100, 200, even 300 kilometers down, the rock fails and releases its energy as an earthquake. That is almost certainly what happened beneath Toba on August 15th. A deep, intermediate depth earthquake inside the descending slab of the Indo-Australian plate. The math fits, the depth fits, the location fits. The tectonic setting fits perfectly. And here is the part that matters most, the part that almost no viral post mentions. A deep slab earthquake and a volcanic eruption are two completely different phenomena, driven by two completely different forces. Think of it this way. Imagine a building. On the top floor, someone is running a kitchen. Heat, gas, the possibility of a fire. That's the volcano, the shallow world of magma, just a few kilometers below the surface. Now imagine that 170 floors below, deep in the bedrock foundation, a steel beam under enormous pressure suddenly snaps. You'd feel it. The whole building might shudder. But that snapping beam in the deep foundation has almost nothing to do with whether the kitchen on the top floor is about to catch fire. They're in the same building, but they're separated by an unimaginable distance and governed by different rules. The Toba earthquake was the beam in the foundation. The supervolcano is the kitchen. And the kitchen, as far as anyone can tell, is cold. So does that mean the fear was pure fantasy? Does it mean the experts I mentioned at the very start of this weren't concerned at all? Not exactly. And this is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the truth sits in a subtle middle ground that neither the panic nor the total dismissal quite captures. If you'd like, drop a comment right now with what you thought when you first saw the headline. Did you assume the supervolcano was erupting? Be honest. I want to see how powerful that first instinct really was, because that instinct is exactly what we need to talk about next. Let's deal with the elephant in the room, because I keep saying Toba is dormant, and I want to be precise about what that word actually means, and why it should be reassuring rather than terrifying. Toba has not erupted in around 74,000 years. To put that in perspective, that's longer than our species has been telling stories, longer than the oldest cave paintings, longer than agriculture, cities, writing, and every civilization that has ever existed, combined many times over. On the timescale of a human life, 74,000 years of silence is effectively forever. Volcanologists who study Toba are blunt about its current state. The scientific consensus is that Toba is dormant, that its volcanic hazards right now are negligible. There are a few faint fumaroles, small vents releasing gas, on Sumatra, the island that sits in the middle of the lake, and there's some residual heat down there. That's the geological equivalent of embers. still warm in a fireplace, long after the fire went out. It tells you there was once a tremendous amount of energy here. It does not tell you the fire is about to roar back to life. Just as importantly, when scientists monitor Toba, they aren't watching for deep earthquakes like the one on August 15th. They're watching for an entirely different set of signals. They're watching for swarms of small, shallow earthquakes clustered right beneath the caldera, the sound of magma cracking its way upward. They're watching for the ground to swell and deform, for the surface to bulge as pressure builds below. They're watching for changes in the gases venting from those fumaroles, for new heat signatures picked up by satellites, for the subtle chemistry that betrays magma on the move. None of that was reported. Satellite observations earlier in the year showed no thermal anomalies, no unrest. The monitoring agency responsible, Indonesia's Center for Volcanology and Geological Hazard Mitigation, focuses precisely on this kind of regional and shallow seismicity. And a deep slab quake 180 kilometers down simply isn't the signal that sets off volcanic alarm bells. So the reassuring truth is this. Not only was the August 15th earthquake the wrong type of earthquake to indicate an eruption, but every other warning sign that would actually matter was absent. The kitchen isn't just cold. There's no smoke, no smell of gas, no flicker of flame anywhere in the room. And yet, there's a reason serious scientists don't laugh off questions about Toba, even when the immediate answer is reassuring. There's a reason the phrase experts on edge isn't entirely wrong, even if it's exaggerated. And to understand that, we have to zoom out from this one earthquake and look at the bigger, stranger picture that makes places like Toba so unsettling to study. Here's the thing about supervolcanoes. They don't behave like normal volcanoes. A normal volcano erupts fairly often on a geological timescale. Every few years, every few decades, every few centuries. It has a rhythm you can study, a personality you can get to know. A supervolcano is different. It can sleep for tens or hundreds of thousands of years. It can go so quiet that the human beings living on top of it forget entirely what it is. And then, on its own vast and indifferent schedule, it can do something that reshapes the planet. Toba has done this not once, but at least 3 times. The eruption 74,000 years ago, the one that nearly rewrote the story of humanity, was actually the youngest of a series. There was another massive caldera-forming eruption around 840,000 years ago, and another around 1.2 million years ago. Toba is not a one-time event. It's a recurring machine, one that builds up pressure over unfathomable stretches of time and then releases it all at once. That's what makes these places so uniquely hard to think about. They operate on a clock so slow that it's almost meaningless to us, and so powerful that when it does strike, nothing we've built can withstand it. We simply have no historical experience of a supervolcanic eruption. No human civilization has ever witnessed one. The last time it happened, we were scattered bands of hunter-gatherers who very nearly didn't make it through. So when a magnitude 6.9 earthquake strikes right at the edge of that machine, even scientists who know full well it was a deep tectonic quake feel a flicker of something. Not alarm exactly, more like respect. A reminder of what sleeps beneath. Because the honest scientific position isn't Toba will never erupt again. Nobody can promise that. The honest position is that Toba will almost certainly erupt again someday on a timescale of tens of thousands of years, and that when it does, there will very likely be years or decades of unmistakable warning signs beforehand. The swelling ground, the shallow swarms, the rising heat, none of which we're seeing now. That's the real answer to the question I asked you at the beginning. Is the supervolcano waking up? No, not by any measure scientists actually use. The August 15th earthquake was a deep tectonic event inside a subducting slab, the wrong type, at the wrong depth, with none of the accompanying signs of volcanic unrest. If you were worried, you can genuinely let that worry go. But, and this is the smaller question I want to leave you with, the fact that we can say that with such confidence is itself the product of something remarkable. Because 100 years ago, we couldn't have. A century ago, this same earthquake would have been a mystery, a terrifying omen, an event people would have interpreted through fear and superstition because they had no way to see inside the earth. Today, within minutes, we knew its magnitude, its precise location, its depth to within a few kilometers, the type of fault that produced it, and the number of people who felt it. We could distinguish almost instantly between a deep slab rupture and the beginnings of a volcanic catastrophe. That ability to look 180 kilometers into solid rock and read what's happening down there is one of the quiet triumphs of modern science. It's easy to take for granted. It's the reason the panic online was answered by facts within hours instead of festering for weeks. And it raises a question worth sitting with. If we can already see this clearly into the Earth, how much clearer will our view become? Will there come a day when we can predict not just what an earthquake was, but what one will be before it happens? Will we one day get real, actionable warning before a supervolcano stirs, decades of lead time enough to prepare? We're not there yet. Not even close, for the deep and chaotic processes that drive these events. But every earthquake, like the one beneath Toba, is another data point, Another line in a story we're still learning to read. Which brings me back to that beautiful, deceptive lake. Millions of people will visit Lake Toba this year. They'll take boats out onto water so still it mirrors the sky. They'll photograph Sumatra Island rising green from the center. They'll enjoy one of the most stunning landscapes in all of Southeast Asia. And most of them will never know they're standing inside the collapsed throat of the most powerful volcano our species has ever survived. There's something almost poetic in that. The site of the closest thing to an apocalypse in human history is now a place people go to relax. The earthquake of August 15th, 2026 didn't change that. Tomorrow the lake will be just as calm, just as beautiful, just as safe as it was the day before. The tourists will come back. The fumaroles on Sumatra will keep releasing their faint wisps of gas the way they've done for tens of thousands of years. And 180 kilometers below, the great cold slab of the Indo-Australian plate will keep sinking, grinding, and occasionally cracking, sending up the deep tremors that have nothing at all to do with the sleeping giant above. The real lesson of this earthquake isn't fear, it's perspective. It's the reminder that we live on a restless planet, that the ground beneath even the most peaceful places has a history and a future written on a timescale we can barely imagine. And it's the reminder that our best defense against panic isn't ignorance or denial, it's understanding. The more clearly we can see what the Earth is actually doing, the less power the frightening stories have over us. So the next time you see a headline screaming that a supervolcano is stirring, remember Toba. Remember to ask the questions the scientists asked. How deep was it? What type of fault? Were there any signs of magma on the move? Because those questions are the difference between fear and knowledge. And knowledge, in the end, is the only thing that's ever really kept us safe. The Earth beneath us will never stop moving. But we're getting better all the time at understanding what those movements mean. And that might be the most reassuring thing of all. If this cleared something up for you, or if it made you think about the ground under your feet a little differently, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are looking for the truth instead of the panic. Subscribe if you want more breakdowns like this one, where we take the scariest headlines and find out what's really going on. And tell me in the comments, what natural event has always fascinated or frightened you the most? I read them all, and your suggestions often become the next story. Until then, stay curious and stay grounded.